So I've had this theory since the early days of Inazuma that all non-human species in Teyvat share a lineage, and thanks to recent information from Columbina and Nicole, I can make a compelling case for this, nearly 4 years after I had the initial idea. I am so fast. But see, the characteristics of these two lovely ladies strongly suggest that every non-human species in Teyvat can be classified as a type of angel. Now, obviously, I will be making a case for this later in the video, but that's not the only thing I want to do today, because if all non-humans of Teyvat are indeed angelic, then I think it's possible we can categorize them into different types of angels, and even into different ranks within a greater hierarchy of heaven. So in this video, I will be making a case for classifying all non-human entities in Teyvat as angels, a process which will involve a sort of a family tree. And then I'm going to be sorting all of them into an angelic hierarchy based on a 5th century book called the Celestial Hierarchy, which was written by Pseudo-Dionysus. No, that's not his real name. No one knows his real name, so don't ask. And because this hierarchy isn't something I'm just making up out of nowhere, I'm also going to need to explain how this hierarchy works. So the final product is going to look something like a tier list, and it'll probably be the only tier list I ever make on this channel, so savor it. But before we get into that, I must recognize that some of you might be interested in procuring some more of these playable angels for yourself, so allow me to introduce you to the sponsor of today's video, Eniba, a top-tier one-stop top-up shop fulfilling all of your primo gem needs. But Ash, I hear you say, there are a lot of top-up shops out there already. Why should I use Eniba? Excellent question, curious viewer. That sounds oddly like Paimon, even though I didn't mean to do that. Most top-up shops are a use-at-your-own-risk kind of thing, because using them can violate a game's terms of service. But Eniba's dedication to TOS compliance means that you can shop all you want without worrying about anything bad happening to your account, which is fantastic, as is the top-up experience itself. All you need to do is head to eniba.com or use a link in the description, select the game that you want, pick the pack that you want, and then enter your server region and user ID. Once the checkout process is complete, your purchase will be delivered within minutes. Now what's that you say? Eniba has no discount, so it's cheaper to buy elsewhere? Well, that's not totally true, because with every purchase, Eniba gives you cash back that you can use on your next purchase. I kinda like this system better than discounts because it's more consistent and you're never left wondering why the price in your cart is different than the price on the tag. And if you're not into topping up, well, you're in luck because Eniba also sells keys for software, video games, VPNs, and even gift cards. So if you buy a friend a game for the holidays, you could use that cash back from your purchase to get something nice for yourself. So shop smart this holiday season and use my link in the description to check out Eniba. You'll make Santa and I very proud. A big thanks to Eniba for sponsoring this video, and now we're gonna get back to the video and kick things off by explaining why everything in Teyvat is angels. And we're also gonna be fleshing out this bizarre family tree while we're at it. Like I said in the intro, I've had this idea for a very long time, but struggled with gathering enough evidence to justify my vibes. Cause like, my vibes back in version 2 were mostly based on the fact that Seelies were associated with angelic things like the Hall of Angels, but they were named after Scottish fairies. And despite the fact that they look nothing alike, I've always associated Seelies with crystal flies, because crystal flies are basically fancy crystalline butterflies, and like throughout my childhood, fairies were always associated with insects and were often depicted with like having butterfly wings, so my neurons just kept connecting crystal flies to Seelies without anything substantial in-game to back it up. And also, the me from back then was looking at the Adepti and the Yokai like, these guys are kind of like based on little spirits, right? That kind of sounds like a type of fairy, or at least a fae, to me. And then we got to Sumeru, where we learned about the Jinn who were born from flowers that sprouted from a Seelie's blood, and that also sounded like fairies because fairies are often born of flowers. And then we learned that the Jinn were placed into machines, and then they were granted a power core that looks just like a crystal fly core, which didn't help this conspiracy in my brain. And I don't even think I need to mention how similar Oceanids look when compared to Seelies, or even to Thundering Manifestations, because I was also counting them in this equation, partly because Oceanids are also called pure water elves in Chinese, and elves are originally part of the Fae alongside the fairies. But this all came to a head later on when Xianyin came out and confirmed that races like the Adepti, or at least the non-human ones of the Adepti, manifest directly from the elements themselves. While it didn't really help my whole angels and fairies are the same sort of thing, and also the Adepti and the Yokai and the Oceanids are the same kind of thing agenda, it did kind of help me lump them into a singular lineage. They were all elemental beings, so they must be connected somehow. And now we have Nicole, who came along and declared herself one of the original Seelies, while also wearing accessories that look like crystal flies. And at this point, I think I'm going a little bit nuts. But it did kind of help me solidify this idea that fairies are angels, which is neat and helpful. Especially because I can now link fairies and crystal flies to the demon gods because demons are just fallen angels and Zeelies are quite literally declared angels in-game. I love the confirmation. But there was still one thing that bothered me, and it's this line from Breeze Amidst the Forest, which reads, "Typically, when life arises from the elements, it either descends and becomes a slime or ascends and becomes a crystal fly. Rarely does this process give rise to dangerous elemental monsters. Elemental dragons are rarely seen and have the powers to match the gods of old." Which directly links this process of life arising from the elements to become a crystal fly or fairy or even a dragon, which means that dragons are in theory one of the fae and therefore also angels, which checks out because look at Columbina. She looks like an angel but is actually a moon goddess, and the moons were made by the Dragon King Nibelung, who was from the light realm, aka the elemental realm, and all of these angelic or fae-like eldritch, which means elf-like beings, are born of the elements. Ergo, everything is angel, and everything is also dragon because dragons are angels. If all of that was a little bit too messy and hard to follow for you, don't worry, I'm gonna walk you through a mostly complete chart of the angelic genealogy, which should clarify a lot of things. Okay, let's begin. So the Dragon King Nibelung was born alongside the world of Teyvat and is responsible for the creation of dragonkind, which were the first life forms on the planet as far as we know. And that makes him the original god of the world. And a god born of the light realm, which is what he is, also makes him the father of lights, which is what the celestial hierarchy calls the god. Like the one god, the only Abrahamic god that there is. So I think this comparison checks out. So the original god of the world, Nibelung, used his will to create the three moon goddesses, Aria, Sonnet, and Canon. Now there is an intermediary step here that I had to add because as far as we know, the moons appear to be a little bit younger than the rest of the dragons. So primordial energies like phlogiston and the primordial sea should predate them to some degree. But they also seem to be directly connected to the moon's power of Kuvaki. Now, I have gone into depth on how I think the mechanics of this work, but for the purposes of today's video, I have made the assumption that Nibelung made Kuvaki first, which was then split into phlogiston and primordial seawater, and then also used to fashion the moons directly. I don't know if that's actually how it goes, but for the sake of the visuals, I'm going with it. So these moon spirits were called Aria, Sonnet, and Canon, and they governed the eternal, iridescent, and frost moon, respectively. Do note that we only know for certain that Aria was the eternal moon. The assignments of Iridescent Sonnet and Frost Moon Canon are assumptions that I'm making based on the fact that Solnari appears to be another name for Sonnet, and Rerir was the Rasher of Solnari, or the Hunter of the Crimson Moon. And remember that the Crimson Moon is the Iridescent Moon. So Sonnet kind of has to be the Iridescent Moon, and that leaves Canon as the Frost Moon. Again, not confirmed in-game. I'm just making a rational assumption. Now, Columbina is also a moon goddess, but she was not part of this original creation process, and thus not made by Nibelung, so I've marked her down as being born of the Frost Moon. Although that's not totally accurate, as she doesn't really appear to be a reincarnation or replacement for the Frost Moon, despite being the goddess worshipped by the Frost Moon Scions. Instead, she's confirmed to be the Welkin Moon. Give her $5 a month and she gives you primos. So as far as we can tell, she wasn't made by Nibelung, but instead born from a wish made by the other moons, so that's why she's depicted as the child of the Frost Moon here. Incidentally, this might mean that Columbina is actually the sister of Andreas, since the wolves are children of the moon. I don't know if that's metaphorical or literal, but I'm gonna take it as literal because I think it's funny. Okay, so adjacent to the moons, we have the other creations of Nibelung, the dragon sovereigns. While technically elemental in nature while they manifest onto that, they appear to have been born from more primordial forms of elements, so I have them branching off of Kuvaki because Kuvaki would be split into the modern elements later on by the heavenly principles. Now, we don't know a whole lot about the followers of the dragons, apart from Shwi-Coatl, who fashioned his dragon lords from phlogiston and seems to have split Kukulkan from himself. And that all seems to have spiraled down into the Saurians, who should have some sort of shared parentage here, but also a weaker connection to the primordial elements, which makes them less divine and more mortal. This is arguably the same situation the Baptismal Bishops are in, although their connection is to the primordial sea instead. Geo-Bishops too, although I don't know what primordial power they would be of because we just don't have one in Leeway, or at least not one that we know of. But Baptismal Bishops aren't the only dragons on the side of the primordial sea in Nouvelette. We also have Scylla, or Skyla, I still don't know how to say his name. By token of his title of Dragon Prince, we can assume that he was probably on the same level as a Dragon Lord, but you know, primordial sea style instead of phlogiston style. So unfortunately, that's mostly it for Nibelung's known offspring. So now we can introduce the Heavenly Principles, the new god of Teyvat, because they are the progenitor of a whole separate line of angelic entities. Although I do want to point out before we continue that, despite the fact that I am considering this a separate lineage altogether, the Heavenly Principles didn't just make things from their own power. As far as we know, a lot of the stuff that they made was fashioned from Nibelung's remnants. So like Kuvaki, the Primordial Sea, and Phlogiston, and that kind of stuff. So in a way, you could say that both Nibelung and the Heavenly Principles are the parents of this particular lineage, which is again why everything is both angel and dragon. Okay, so the Heavenly Principles is credited with creating the 4 shades, Istaroth, Asmodee, Renova, and Naberius, although we're not really sure how. Perhaps they used their own will like Nibelung did, or perhaps they fashioned them from Kuvaki, I don't know. That does seem to be the most likely for me, especially since I actually think Istaroth might be a former moon, but that's a separate theory. But from the shades, we really only have one clearly defined lineage extending down from Naberius. That said, as the Shade of Life, Naberius should be responsible for creating a lot of different life forms into that, but there's only one that we know of as angelic or, somewhat heavenly, and that's Egeria, who Naberius created to take Nuvalet's place in the Primordial Sea. Now, there's hints about her creation being similar to that of a dragon, so I've kind of laid out Egeria's parentage as being of both Naberius and the Primordial Sea. And from Egeria allegedly came the Oceanids, like Rhodea and Focalor, the latter of which split herself in two to create the mortal we know of as Farina. So somehow this angelic lineage ended in a human. Now look, technically we can make the argument that there is a second lineage here that extends off of Istaroth, because Venti was a fragment of her 1,000 Winds, and Zebai is apparently sometimes called Istaroth's daughter. However, Zebai is called a Seelie specifically, and although Seelies are angels alongside everything else in this chart, they're angels of a very specific lineage. The ones we call Seelies were created when the Heavenly Principles gave shape to moonlight, meaning the Seelies should be born of a union between the Heavenly Principles and the moons. And frankly, I don't really know what Venti's real deal is, so I'm going to ignore him. Noteworthy and confirmed Seelies include Koitar, Nabu Malikata, Sibylla, Nicole, Yahalt-Tekutin, and Zebai, and several of them are parents in their own right. Koitar in particular created the Snowland Fae, at least partially from the light of the Frost Moons, while Yahalt-Tekutin created the Wyab spirits. Nabu Malikata created the flowers from her blood that blossomed into the Jinn, and then later fashioned a phoenix-like bird called the Simurgh from her own divine power, who then later dove into Egeria's remains and created the Pari. All of the angels I just mentioned were born from primordial powers which end up looking like the elements, but the elements were actually created separately from all of this when the Heavenly Principles split the white light of Kuvaki into 7 colors. Life arising from these colors or elements could evolve in 3 main ways. If they attained sentience, they would turn into something like Xiao, Xianyan, or Yaimiko. If no sentience developed, then the result would be a lower spirit like a crystal fly, or other elemental life forms like a slime or a hydrophantasm. This process seems to be currently influenced by the Heavenly Principles if the description for the lava dragon statue is anything to go by, because the lava dragon statue was an attempt to make a new race based on humans, but the Heavenly Principles restricted its ability to gain sentience, which is kind of similar to what probably happens to slimes. And that's basically the entire genealogy. But you're gonna notice that a few things are missing from this list, like many of the Archons and the Aranara. I didn't include the Archons because most of them have obscured parentage with the exception of Farina and all of the Pyro Archons, who unlike Farina were born human and therefore do not belong on this list. Some Archons may have manifested from the elements, but others might be from other races like Seelies, Shades, or even the Snowland Fae. Or maybe even a Dragon Sovereign lineage. It's really hard to say right now. But then we have like Rukkhadevata, who we do know the lineage of. She's an avatar of Irminsul, so she was born from Irminsul. But the problem is that we don't know where Irminsul came from, so I just don't have any idea where to put it on this map. Which also means that the Aranara she made are not on this map either. So, sorry about that. Now before we move on to talking about the angelic hierarchy, because I am done with this bizarre family tree, I do want to point out the fact that aside from dragons, archons, and shades, and the moons, nearly every other human-shaped angel or angelic being can and often does possess a vision or a moon wheel, because the two are interchangeable. But this paints Venti's statement about how humans who possess a vision can become gods in a new light, because it's basically saying that humans with a vision can become angels. This is something that is possible in Abrahamic Abrahamic and Gnostic literature, and that also means that humans should appear somewhere on this lineage map as like mortal angels at some point. Kind of like the Pyro-Archons. They ascended from humanhood to archonhood. That's not a good way to say that, but whatever. It's also very likely that mortal dragons like Saurians and Bishops also have a vision-like equivalent, but that it just stays inside of them. I've actually made a couple of theories about this, which you can check out if you want to learn more about why I say this. But for the purposes of ranking, I am not going to include any mortals on this list, except for Farina. Just know that mortals can move into the hierarchy, but they are not currently part of that hierarchy. Like, they are not born to that hierarchy normally. So with that in mind, let me move on to explain how the celestial hierarchy of Pseudo-Dionysus works. Like I said in the intro, the primary source I'm going to be using to sort angels into ranks is the Celestial Hierarchy by Pseudo-Dionysus. Not only is this book one of the most comprehensive pieces of Christian angelology in existence, it is also the one that seems to fit the most closely with the patterns that I see in Genshin's pantheon. But I'm also going to be pulling from works of St. Thomas Aquinas, who wrote about this extensively, as well as some Gnostic works, because while Nibelung's half of the genealogy looks to be quite biblical, the Heavenly Principles portion appears to be a little bit more Gnostic, which is still biblical, but it's like Bible stuff with spice. There will be links where you can read these works in the description if you wanna, but they are not a prerequisite since I am going to explain how this Dionysian system works right now. The angelic hierarchy is split into 3 ranks, also known as orders, each of which contains 3 types of angelic beings referred to as choirs. In this system, angels are not ordered by strength, but are instead grouped together based on their responsibilities and general domain of influence. For example, angels of the first order concern themselves with the affairs of heaven itself and their service to God, while angels of the third order concern themselves with the affairs of the earth, leaving the angels of the second order to act as a sort of intermediary body that handles the communications and relationships between heaven and earth, and also the first and third orders. In addition to this, each choir within an angelic order appears to correspond to the themes of structure, knowledge, and action, respectively. Now, technically speaking, structure here is supposed to be divine order, but since each category of angels is called an order, I thought the original name would be a little bit too confusing, so structure it is. Now, while there isn't necessarily a division of strength between the angelic orders, there is a division of knowledge and influence. Angels of the highest order have the greatest access to universal knowledge due to their close proximity with God, and thus they also have authoritative control over the domains of the lower orders. Likewise, the second order has more knowledge and influence than the third order, but less knowledge and influence than the first, again, due to their position relative to heaven. This is a pretty common setup regardless of the system of hierarchy that you're referencing, because higher angelic or demonic entities essentially always emanate downwards to lesser entities who occupy the sublunary sphere, and the shape that they take while in the mortal realm does vary quite a bit. Also important to note that the angelic rankings are not limited to lineage. Lineage kind of determines the starting rank, but it is possible, although uncommon, to move between the ranks. It's like doing a career swap. So yeah, that's basically how the system works in a nutshell. Next, we're going to go into more detail about each order's responsibilities while also sorting Genshin's non-human species into their respective ranks. That said, I need to first make one minor adjustment to the Dionysian system. That is to say, I need to add a 4th, or rather 0th, rank for God. This isn't necessary for the Dionysian system, typically, because that system only accounts for a single god. But Genshin isn't just looking at its celestial hierarchy through a Christian lens, it's also accounting for Gnostic influences. In other words, multiple gods. So as we established, the original, true, Abrahamic-style god of Teyvat should be the Dragon King Nibelung, since he was born alongside the planet and was the progenitor of the original species that propagated that world. He's also the dragon born of the Light Realm, whom the other dragons refer to as the Father or Formidable Father, which is in line with how Dionysus refers to God as the Father of Lights, so I think calling Nibelung the true god is fair and justified. That said, Nibelung was defeated by the Heavenly Principles, who now rules Teyvat as if they were the true god. This makes the Heavenly Principles a good candidate for the role of the Gnostic Demiurge, or the false god. What's important to note is that the Heavenly Principles has been identified as a being known as a Descender, which is a title that has never been truly clarified for us in-game, but it appears to be a title given to anyone who has the potential to become the ruler of the world, so a new god. And as far as we know, there are only 4 of these, so I am including them in my list here, but only really the Heavenly Principles is relevant for the purposes of this video. Because as far as I know, the other 3 Descenders haven't actually, made any sort of creatures that we need to sort But just know that I had to make this zeroth tier because we have potentially 5 gods to deal with. But okay, enough with my made-up zeroth rank. Let's move on to the first angelic order. The first angelic order is made up of the Seraphim, Cherubim, and Ophanim, and primarily concerns itself with the affairs of heaven. These angels command the lower orders and receive directives and knowledge from God directly. Angels of the first order tend to have higher level responsibilities, like weaving fate or overseeing the flow of time. So they don't tend to directly meddle in the affairs of the mortal realm, although they can do that, they just don't. The distribution of these responsibilities is split by choir, so let's start with the highest choir first, the Seraphim. Seraphim are the highest angels of the first order and thus embody structure. They're typically described as having 6 wings, 2 of which are covering their eyes, although depending on the source material, they can have up to 12. As the highest ranking of the angels, they carry out God's direct orders and sing sacred hymns. Their name, Seraph, can mean either burning or serpent, which is why they're sometimes called dragons in non-biblical texts, and also why they're so closely associated with fire. But more so than fire, Seraphim are associated with the holy light that fire seems to emit. In fact, they are sometimes referred to as beings made of pure light with a direct connection to God. They're also considered to be the throne bearers of God, and therefore they rarely leave the heavenly realm. They also appear to be synonymous with the Gnostic glories, although those number in the hundreds of thousands, so maybe Kuhenki are being counted here, I don't know. In Genshin, though, the Seraphim are most likely the moon goddesses. They're the angels closest to the original god Nibelung, who was a dragon, and their powers stem from the holy light in the form of Kuvaki, or moonlight. And as goddesses of the moon, they're the most likely to remain in heaven most of the time, or at least most of their work would be carried out there. We can see more similarities between the moon goddesses and the Seraphim in Columbina. Like the Seraphim, she boasts 6 wings and also covers her eyes, and she has a natural inclination for singing. Now I do wonder if her connection to the hydro element implies a connection to the Chalkydri, or water serpents, who were called the flying elements of the sun, and also frequently associated with the Seraphim. If the sun is Nibelung since he's the father of lights, then I kind of feel like this checks out, especially since the moons were said to love the stars of daybreak and the Chalkydri would burst into song to announce the arrival of dawn. Also, as the angels closest to God, the Seraphim most closely reflect his attributes, which also includes his attitude towards life on earth, or in our case, Teyvat. Biblically, this means they are the angels that embody divine love, which checks out because Nibelung loved his little planet and all the life in it. Fitting then that the primary responsibility of the moon goddesses was to protect this planet and all who lived in it, and also that Columbina's chosen constellation takes the shape of a heart. Okay, so moon goddesses are Seraphim, the angels closest to Nibelung. So what about the next choir? The Cherubim. They held a position very close to God, so who are they? Well, I strongly suspect that Genshin's Cherubim are the 4 shades. Cherubim are messengers of God's will, and often the ones who act in God's stead, a characteristic we certainly see within the shades. They're also associated with the number 4, as they often have 4 wings and 4 faces. And although Genshin's shades don't have 4 wings or 4 faces, there are 4 of them. Also, you can make the argument that each of the 4 shades represents one of the 4 heads of the cherubim. Those heads were supposed to resemble a human, a bird, a beast, and an ox. And if we look at the namesakes of each of the shades, we have Naberius as the bird, Renova as the human, Ishtaroth as the ox, thanks to Ishtar, and Asmodee as the beast. No, it's not perfect, but it works well enough for me. Cherubim are also considered the angels of knowledge by Pseudo-Dionysus, and thus they embody knowledge, and they're also the keepers of the new covenant. And this is the main reason why I think the cherubim are the shades. Logically speaking, the old or original covenant should have been made with an older or original god like Nibelung. So if the cherubim are upholding a new covenant, then they are upholding the covenant of a new god, which in this case should be the heavenly principles, which would then make the cherubim the shades. I will also point out that the Shade of Space, Asmodee, was originally considered a cherub before they became a demon, which makes me giggle because the name cherub is also used for putos, which are small winged children generally recognized as like depictions of or references to Cupid, which is once again really funny because Asmodee was associated with love, or at least cursed love. And it also makes the whole Asmodee to Paimon theory stand out a little bit more. because Paimon would be a little Puto in this case. Ishtaroth is also interesting in this context because her namesake, Astaroth, was once a seraph before their fall. This does make you wonder if this goddess of time was once a moon goddess, one who didn't perish during the War of Funerary Flame. But that's highly speculative. There is more to say about the cherubim, but I think you kind of get the idea, so let's move on and talk about the third choir of the First Order, the Ophanim. The Ophanim are described as the 4 great wheels connected to God's heavenly throne, which is also a chariot. Now I know what you're thinking. If there are only 4 Ophanim, why aren't they the 4 shades instead? Or maybe you're thinking about how the Ophanim are wheels and that the moons are also wheels, and there are technically 4 moons, so why aren't they the Ophanim instead? And it's because Pseudo-Dionysus considers the Ophanim and the choir of the thrones to be the same thing. Now it's actually a good thing to compare the Seraphim moon goddesses to the thrones because a wheel in this context could be interpreted to be a coiled serpent, which would link this choir with the dragons rather than the heavenly principles, which means that we're looking down Nibelung's half of the genealogy chart to find our perfect candidate, the 7 dragon sovereigns. Why perfect? Well, Pseudo-Dionysus described the thrones as a foundation of God's authorities, manifestations of God's power, so their main responsibilities included overseeing God's judgments, orders, and records. And that to me sounds a lot like the 7 dragon sovereigns. Not only is each dragon sovereign supposed to possess a divine throne in heaven that encompasses their authority over Teyvat, but dragons in general are quite concerned with contracts, records, and of course, divine judgment. I think if you wanted to illustrate the relationship between the choirs of this order, we could do so by looking at a chariot. God would sit in his chariot and decide where he wants to go. His seraphim would act as the drivers of the chariot, so he gives his desired destination to them. The seraphim then direct the cherubim who are pulling the chariot on which way to go, and the thrones act as the wheels to ensure that the chariot moves according to God's wishes. So the seraphim embody structure by providing directions, the cherubim embody knowledge by knowing how to move the cart in the desired direction, and the thrones embody action by ensuring the cart can move as desired. Which is partly why the heavenly principles did not get rid of the seraphim or the thrones when they took over. They're kind of needed, or at least their powers and authorities are needed. And that wraps up our first order, which was pretty straightforward all things considered, but it is in the second order where things start to get a little bit messy. The second order of angels is made up of dominions, virtues, and powers, and they act as a sort of intermediary between the first and third orders. Now, based on our genealogy chart, this order best suits the roles of the Seelies, and also entities like the Dragon Lords, mostly because the Seelies and the Dragon Lords are pretty close to the first order of heaven, but they also have a lot of say in what goes on in Teyvat. This dualistic relationship earns them the moniker of Divine Envoy as they carry messages of the higher orders to the lower orders, and also to the mortal realm. But I do think there's an interesting split in responsibilities here, so let's start off with our first choir, the Dominions. Dominions are the choir most concerned with governance and conveying the will of the upper orders. They're essentially the leaders of the lower orders, and they function kind of like a governmental bureaucracy or the upper management of a large company. You can also think of them as stewards or the ones responsible for the delegation of tasks, which is why we associate them with structure. This description best fits entities like Shweekwaddle's 13 Dragon Lords as well as Kukulkan, who were not only stewards of specific regions of Natlan, but also held governmental office and concerned themselves with carrying out the will of their sovereign who belonged to the First Order. Also, Pseudo-Dionysus refers to dominions as lordships, so it only feels right to assign dragon lords to this choir. And I know a prince isn't technically a lord, but a prince is still a pretty elevated title, so I think we should also count Scylla, Skyla, or Scylla, however you say the name, please help me, within the choir of dominions as well. I assume other sovereigns had similar attendants in the dominion class, but there's no information to draw from in-game. Now, the reason I'm not including any Seelies in this choir is because the responsibilities of the Seelies are a much better fit for the next 2 choirs, so I'm going to be sorting the named Seelies into the choirs of virtue and power based on what we know about them. Also known as the authorities, virtues are called the Lords of Causality and the caretakers of the cosmic order within the material world. For this reason, they're associated with fate and thus methods of prophecy like astrology, or perhaps taking care of the branches of Irminsul, which is a tree directly connected to the fate and history of the world. They ensure that things operate as they should, which in Genshin terms probably means that they were responsible for ensuring mankind did not deviate from the mandate of fate issued by the heavenly principles. For that reason, we can say that they embody knowledge. Seelies of this choir were likely the ones responsible for guiding mankind and teaching them whatever the heavenly principles thought they should know, thus making them the emissaries or messengers of the higher orders, hence divine envoys. Now, we know the names of several important Seelies, 3 of which I think easily fit the mold for virtues, specifically Nicole, Sibylla, and Nabu Malikata. Nicole fancies herself a bit of a prophet and observer of Irminsul, as well as an avid historian and teacher. Likewise, Sibylla was a prophetess stationed at the base of one of Irminsul's branches. Nabu Malikata is a little bit trickier to justify at first blush, but she's literally named after a scribe god, and her most infamous feat was bestowing Destrit with forbidden knowledge, so I feel like it kind of makes the most sense to place her in the Virtue Choir. As for the other named Seelies, I kind of feel like they belong in the next choir, the Powers. The Powers are kind of like a warrior class of angels. Their job was to eliminate or restrain evil forces, sometimes through combat and sometimes through purification, and they were also to act as divine intervention on behalf of some humans. For this reason, among others, they embody the concept of direct action. They've also been referred to as sentries or watchmen, and they are tasked with protecting the crossroads and borders of the world, especially the border between heaven and earth. Now, before I address the most interesting implication of that last part, I would like to assign the Seelies Koitar, Yohaltakuten, and Zebai to this choir. While it is true that Koitar was first discovered at the base of one of Irminsul's branches, like some of the virtues, and she also possessed a gift of prophecy, she was also the leader of the rebellion against heaven, which kind of puts her in a bit of a weird spot. I'm opting to place her in the Power Choir over the Virtue Choir though, because I personally think that Koitar is someone that we know, but also someone I will not name because now is not the time for a very long explanation. Just know that I'm kind of biased about this placement. Yohaltakuten, on the other hand, might not be noted in any combat-like situations as far as I know, but she did take up guardianship of Natlan by following Renova's instructions to reconstruct the ley lines. This made her quite literally the Lord of the Crossroads, of the Nation of War, no less. And she was in many ways responsible for conquering Natlan as well, or at least instructing humans on how to go about it, so I kind of feel like she fits the description of a power. And then we have Zebai, the Celadon mare, whose placement here is admittedly a bit shaky. She is presumably a former resident of the moon, and she's also called the Daughter of Istaroth, which should make her a better candidate for the Choir of Virtue rather than Power. But if you look at her list of accomplishments, they're all kind of combat-based. She's recorded as having fought extensively alongside the Adepti and Liyue during the Archon War, and she also seems to have taken up a sort of guardianship over the land while she waits for something to happen, so I kind of think she fits best here. It's possible that once upon a time she was a virtue and then she became a power later. Now, with those placements made, I would like to submit a rather speculative candidate for the Power Choir here, because I think this choir perfectly describes Alice. After all, Alice is the protector of Teyvat's borders, and protecting the boundaries between heaven and earth is a task that's assigned to the Seelies of the Power Choir. And also, the patron deity of the witches is called Hecate, and Hecate is the guardian of passageways and gateways, and she's usually represented by symbols like keys. And Alice is a witch. But for her to belong to the Power Choir, she also kind of needs to be a Seelie, which I think is plausible because she's noted as belonging to a long-lived species, which Seelies definitely are, and her long pointed ears make it likely that her lineage is related to the Fae, who are part of the angelic lineage. Although it is worth mentioning that Nicole does have pointy but not long ears, while Zebai doesn't have pointed ears at all. So who knows if there's actually a meaning to the ears. Also, Nicole is both a Seelie and a witch, and Alice is technically her elder, so there's that. And also, there's the fact that Nicole has a solid golden halo around her hat, while Zebai has a golden moon-shaped halo-looking thing that matches our written description of Nabu Malikata's halo horns. And that has made me suspect that Alice's concept of a hat isn't a hat at all, but a halo. You can also make the argument that Nicole also protects the borders of Teyvat, which should qualify her to be a power instead of a virtue, but she only really does so alongside Alice, and it doesn't really appear to be her top priority or her main assignment. So my guess is that these two kind of help each other out when they can, and there may even be some crossover between powers and virtues. So perhaps we should think of these choirs as more of like job titles that you can swap between, but are generally born into. In any case, we don't really have time to dive into all the ways Alice could be a Seelie or why she would therefore be a power, so just, take this with a grain of salt, I'm speculating. But now it's time to move on to our third and final order. The third order contains the choirs of principalities, archangels, and guardian angels, most of whom are non-human entities predominantly concerned with the mortal realm, often taking up permanent residence there and making this order the furthest one from God. Now, there's a lot of movement between the choirs of the third order. In theory, at least, any angel of the lower two choirs can be promoted into a higher choir. That is to say, archangels and guardian angels can be promoted to principality, and principalities can be demoted into archangels or guardian angels. This is again why I was thinking about them as like job titles that you get born into but can swap between later. And just as a reminder, for this order more than any of the others, it is important to remember that these rankings are not a measure of strength. They are a measure of authority and responsibility. Now, let's talk about the highest choir of this order, the Principalities. Principalities, also known as rulers or princes, are angels that protect, guide, and govern nations or institutions, making them the embodiment of structure within the third order. In Teyvat, we call the principalities archons because in Gnostic texts, archons are called princes, and a principality is a government of a prince or a region governed by a prince. The archons govern over nations specifically, so I don't think there's a better fit than this. Principalities are also a little bit like powers in the sense that they also take on the role of a warrior in order to protect their domain. Kind of like how a king or a president is generally head of a military. This meshes really well with Teyvat's archons since all of them had to win a war in order to seize their position. They were also given a fragment of heaven's power in the form of the 7 divine thrones that originally belonged to the Ophanim, or the thrones, or the 7 dragon sovereigns, whatever you want to call them. It's kind of like giving them an artificial divine mandate. For what it's worth, I also think the god kings like Deshret, Remus, and Decarabia belong to this choir, and I also think that they may have belonged to the original angelic lineage that made up the principalities before the archons came along, since, they kind of performed the same role. This may even extend to other notable regional deities like Orobashi or Havria, but we know little to nothing about their lineages except for the fact that they were of the human realm. Now, this probably means that they manifested directly from the elements like the next 2 choirs, and if we count Zhongli among their number, then that would make sense. While we don't know where Zhongli came from exactly, we do know that he is the foremost or the progenitor of the Adepti, which could suggest an elemental lineage, or at least that he is the most powerful among the Adepti and thus outranked them even prior to the establishment of archonhood, which would in turn grant him the position of a principality. Honestly though, Zhongli is not the best example here because he presumably fell to Teyvat, which suggests he belonged to a higher order originally. But I think you get my point. This order might actually be a little bit more of a power level comparison than the other 2, which could account for the increased movement between the choirs. Regardless, obscured lineages are why none of these figures are on the heritage map. But with the choir of principalities complete, we can move on to the murkiest and messiest of the choirs, the archangels and the guardian angels. The Archangel Choir is primarily responsible for carrying out the orders of the principalities, so I kind of like to think of them as those who are like second in command, but who don't really involve themselves too much with human affairs unless they have to. Still, they are also keepers of what little divine knowledge those of the sublunary sphere are allowed to have, which lets them use a wide variety of magic. So right away, we can assign the yokai, yaksha, and other adepti into this choir, seeing as they are followers of the Electro and Geo Archons respectively. And likewise, I'll include the Oceanids, who were allegedly made by and served the Hydro Archon Egeria. I think the elusive, avoidant nature of the aforementioned angels kind of illustrates what I mean about avoiding mortal affairs but still being involved in them. They're guardians, they're teachers, but they do tend to avoid direct contact with humans. Now, this choir should also include other Fae-like races, such as the Snowland Fae, who were made by Koitar and who serve the Tsaritsa and the Bel-Yitzhar, as well as the Jinn and the Simurgh, both of whom were created by and served Nabu Malikata and also Deshret. I'm also including Andrias in this tier because he challenged Decarabia and Venti for the position of Archon originally, and he also received his powers from a second order angel, and he ended up becoming one of Venti's 4 winds of Mondstadt, which kind of makes him a second in command. But that said, Dvalin is also technically one of the 4 winds, and I'm also still convinced that he is the Animo sovereign, so he should qualify as a throne. But then you have to argue for that really weird relationship between the elemental dragon thrones and the archons, and I don't want to do that, so let's just move on to our final choir, the Guardian Angels. Guardian angels should presumably embody the concept of action, as they are supposed to be the ones most involved in the affairs of the mortal realm, but not necessarily humans. Although they can be guardians of humans, as we see with the Aranara. But most of the time they're tasked with protecting the mortal realm from lesser evils, which in Teyvat is probably the Abyss. So first up, we have the Pari, the result of a union between the Simurgh and Egeria's remains. They're little light-based nature spirits that do work alongside mankind, but mostly busy themselves with the natural world. So very similar to the Aranara. I think the Wayab also fit within the Guardian Choir as spirits who literally guide and guard the tribes of Natlan. I think there's a good case to be made for their submission into the Archangel Choir too, but I'm kind of gonna ignore it. Similarly, I think the lowest ranking dragons like Saurians and Bishops should also fall into this category as they perform a guardian role for the land, and also because dragons are more or less manifestations of nature in general, so I do think we should consider them to be sort of mortalish nature spirits to some degree. Incidentally, I also think that this tier should include Venti, like Venti's original form as that tiny little wind sprite. Partly because he was like the size of a little Pari, he was certainly not of an Archangel rank. Which would imply that Venti was the lowest ranked angel to make it through the Archon War and become a principality. And if that's true, I think it's pretty cool. Now for the big question, where do crystal flies factor into this equation? Well, they don't. By virtue of their limited cognition, they don't really qualify as an angel at all. Due to their lack of sentience, their divinity has become too diluted to even justify the lowest of rankings. And I think a lot of things in Teyvat kind of fall into this category. Now look, I know I didn't rank everything, but I think I did enough to where you could kind of just fill in the blanks. I think the rules and conditions are pretty well defined, and frankly, that's good enough for me. So I think we'll leave it there. But before I go, I would love to thank all of my lovely channel members for putting up with my nonsense and supporting me, especially because they never know what they're really gonna get. You could get a crazy theory, you could get a recap video, you could get something like this, which was completely unexpected. Like really, who thought I was gonna be making one of these? I bet none of you, not a single one of you. It was a surprise. A good surprise or a bad surprise, I don't know, but it was a surprise. Gotta keep you on your toes. But thank you guys, I appreciate it. And also, a very big thanks to you, dear viewer, for watching. And also to Eneba for sponsoring this video, I appreciate that as well. I am off on my next adventure into Theoryland that probably hopefully won't include me having to read about 900 pages of theological research. I swear I was speaking in the most archaic English dialect for like 3 days straight. It was ridiculous. Anyway, thanks again, take care of yourselves, drink some water, and I will see you in the next one. Ta-ta for now!